in eastern Washington, there's a plot of land about half the size of Rhode Island. People call it Hanford, but over the course of the last 75 years or so, the name has meant different things to different people. It was a town not too many people had heard of, and then it was a facility that no one was supposed to talk about. For decades, it produced plutonium for weapons, and that production provided jobs to nearby residents. At the same time, it produced millions of gallons of radioactive and chemical waste, some of which was stored in tanks, some of which was merely dumped into the ground. When the site was no longer needed for plutonium production, a massive cleanup project began. In fact, it's the largest environmental cleanup project in the world. Decades later, this cleanup continues, with an end date at least 2 generations away. Welcome to the premiere episode of Down by the River, The Stories of Hanford, a monthly podcast about the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. My name is Danny Noonan, and I'm with Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. If you're listening to this podcast, you might already know something about Hanford. But hopefully, over this next several months, you'll find out something new, remember something you wish you hadn't forgotten, or maybe just rethink something that you thought you knew. Every month, we'll have a new episode for you that covers one of the many issues connected to Hanford during its long history. From the signing of the Treaty of 1855 that ceded the land to the United States, to the discovery of radium by Marie Curie, to the dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, to the creation of the Hanford Reach National Monument. We will bring you the stories, and more importantly, the people and science behind those stories. This week's story: what is Hanford, and why are social responsible physicians so concerned with it? During World War II, the United States had a secret program to develop the world's first nuclear weapons. Codenamed the Manhattan Project, work on this program almost exclusively took place at 3 top-secret locations: Los Alamos, New Mexico, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. Hanford would be the site of the world's first nuclear reactor. Hanford was chosen for several reasons: a temperate climate for year-round work, nearby railroad lines, a small population that could be easily dispersed, a supply of water from the Columbia River, and electricity from the Grand Coulee Dam. The 3 reactors built at Hanford during World War II would create the plutonium used in the first nuclear test at the Trinity site and the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Building the reactors and producing the plutonium would take 18 months, some 50,000 workers, and $400 million, which in today's dollars would be over $5 billion. And that was just Hanford. The total Manhattan Project cost around $2 billion in 1945, which, if you're going to convert that in today's dollars, would be about $25 billion. All of this money was spent in secrecy. The Manhattan Project was so top secret, most of the workers at Hanford had no idea what was being built. It was a secret they only found out when President Truman came on the radio and announced to the world that not only do the United States have nuclear bombs, but we dropped them on Japan. Twice. The war ended and many people thought Hanford would no longer be needed. But as World War II ended, the Cold War began. Plutonium production not only continued but increased as the United States was in an arms race with the Soviet Union. Hanford expanded from the 3 reactors they had during World War II to 9 reactors by the early 60s. When the last one went online, President John F. Kennedy was there to flip the switch. The reactors would go on to produce about 60% of the plutonium that go into the U.S.'s nuclear arsenal, although I can't be exact with those numbers as they are still classified. As the Cold War came to a close in the late 80s and early 90s, Hanford had stopped producing plutonium and began cleaning up the site. Cleanup at Hanford is under the authority of the U.S. Department of Energy. There are 2 agencies that have oversight on cleanup. They are the Environmental Protection Agency and the Washington State Department of Ecology. Those 3 agencies signed a legally binding contract called the Tri-Party Agreement that sets the terms and milestones of cleanup at Hanford. Basically, the document says what has to be cleaned up and when it has to be cleaned up by. Besides those government agencies, there are several citizen interest groups whose mission, or at least part of their mission, is to be watchdogs about Hanford cleanup. Try to make sure that Hanford is cleaned up in a safe and transparent manner. Those groups include Hanford Challenge, Heart of America Northwest, Columbia Riverkeeper, and my organization, Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. To get the story of WPSR and its involvement at Hanford, I sat down with Dr. Bruce Amundson. He is the current president of WPSR and has been involved with the organization on and off for quite some time. First, I asked him about the origins of PSR.
At the height of the Cold War, when the leadership of the U.S. and the USSR were talking rather glibly about the potential use of nuclear weapons in deterrence and surviving a nuclear war. And a group of physicians in Boston said, there is no surviving a nuclear war. This is completely irresponsible. And they put together the first article on what would happen in the event of a nuclear explosion on a U.S. city. And when that article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, it was the first time that there had been a public discussion and analysis of what a nuclear blast would do. And that led then to individual meetings between the leadership of PSR in the international organization, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, with Gorbachev and Reagan. And it turns out that Gorbachev's personal physician, Dr. Shazov, was the co-president of IPPNW. And on the U.S. side, Bernie Lown and Helen Caldicott had an audience with Reagan and talked to them about what the incredible consequences would be of a nuclear exchange and their responsibility for that, and that there was only prevention. And that was sometime before the Reykjavik conference, when Reagan and Gorbachev came together and came very close to instituting a plan to eliminate nuclear weapons. The history of that is written more completely in a book by Robert Gates that Gates wrote a few years ago. Talks about how that didn't come to pass. But that was the level of engagement that physicians in our organization had in attempting to have the world's leaders deal more realistically with the absolute catastrophe of a nuclear exchange.
Although Hanford's mission was disclosed after the end of World War II, its existence was still shrouded in secrecy. I asked Dr. Amundson how that changed and what was PSR's involvement.
I moved to Spokane to take a position with the Faculty of the Family Practice residency, a UW-affiliated residency, in 1979. And about that time, there began to be questions about what was happening at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. The reservation by that time had been in existence almost 40 years, but two things began to happen. One was stories began to leak out from farmers around the area who reported incidents over the years of workers at Hanford in protective garb, white garb, fanning out across their fields with instruments, collecting samples. Nobody knew what they were doing. Nobody asked permission. They didn't think anything of it at the time, I guess. But that was accompanied by a few whistleblowers at Hanford who talked to local media, particularly in Spokane. And the combination of those farmers wondering what they were concerned about off-site and local reporters began to ask questions led to articles claiming that there had been releases from Hanford in the past that had never been acknowledged. Now let me point out that up until about 1984 or 85, which would be 40 years after production of material was begun on Hanford, the official position of the U.S. government and the Department of Energy at that time was that no radiation had escaped outside the boundaries, not only of Hanford, but of any of the nuclear weapons production facilities across the U.S. That was the official position, and that had not been challenged. With this information from the whistleblowers particularly, it was clear that was a lie. And an organization formed in Spokane, initiated by Dr. William Huff, who was a Unitarian minister, and members of the Unitarian Church formed what was called HEAL, the Hanford Education Action League, which began to ask questions and try to pry into what had gone on in Hanford based on their concerns about releases. HEAL, along with the Spokane chapter of PSR, which we formed in the early 80s, mostly in response to the nuclear weapons concerns about the Cold War, filed a Freedom of Information Act asking for documents specifically related to some dates when large releases might have occurred based on information from the whistleblowers. That resulted in, I believe, 1984, we'll have to check the date, in the release of about 20,000 pages of documents recounting production activities and off-site releases at Hanford. That blew the lid off the government's official secrecy for the last 40 years. It was pivotal, because following that, people around other weapons production sites began to do the same thing, and the whole culture of secrecy of the Department of Energy was destroyed, and we then came to understand how much extensive the releases had been. Very briefly, at Hanford, we then quickly found out that there had been massive releases of particularly iodine-131 as a product of recovering plutonium. Early on in the production, when they were in a race to get material plutonium for the bomb. And subsequently, or similarly, there were releases to groundwater, to surface water, massive releases of radiation. There's a whole range of sequelae that happened after that. But the pivotal piece of information for history is that the work that was done, not just through PSR, but through HEAL and investigative journalists in Spokane, particularly Karen Doran Steele with the Spokesman Review, were pivotal in puncturing the culture of dishonesty and secrecy of the U.S. government.
So the Freedom of Information Act was submitted in January of 1986. By February, the U.S. Department of Energy released 19,000 pages of documents of previously classified information about Hanford. This included details about radiation releases into the air, water, and waste being dumped into the ground. By 1988, Hanford was divided up into 4 areas for inclusion on the National Priorities List, also known as Superfund sites. By May of 1989, the Tri-Party Agreement was signed by the Department of Energy, the EPA, and the Department of Ecology. And here we are, 26 years later. While there has been some successful cleanup at Hanford, we still have a long way to go. One of the biggest challenges is the 56 million gallons of nuclear waste being stored in 177 underground tanks. 67 of these tanks have leaked already at some point. Right now, the plan is to turn all of the waste into glass. This is a process called vitrification. While it'll still be radioactive, it'll be easier to contain and store. But the facility that will do that, known as the waste treatment plant, is not finished being built yet. It is not even finished being designed yet. With cleanup at Hanford having gone on for so long, and the end still so far away, I asked Dr. Amundson what he thought about the cleanup process so far.
Well, the efforts to somehow ameliorate that site, so-called cleanup, is sort of a misnomer, because radiation is forever, and so you move it from one place to the next. But mainly it's to store it in places where it can't continue to leach out into the environment, whether it's equipment and machinery, or whether it's wastewater, or whether it's fuel rods. And that's now been going on for, 30 years. Sometime in the mid to late 80s, there began to be attention to deal with this, and there's plans to deal with the major elements, decommissioning and tearing down buildings. But what I think is most distressing about this is, while it's an immensely complicated site, one of the most complicated and extensively contaminated sites on the planet, the effectiveness and the efficiency and the performance of the U.S. government through the Department of Energy is, I think, malfeasance. There's been a cycle of contractors that come in with contracts who are funded for billions of dollars to do various elements of cleanup. The leadership from the Department of Energy turns over every few years of who's responsible for the site. Yes, there's public oversight, but the ability to really hold them accountable, even at the level of the state through the Tri-Party Agreement, is a modest effectiveness, and the waste and the incredible funneling of dollars into that site, and the inefficiencies of creating the plants that will deal with the high-level waste storage in the tank farm, is a story that's yet to be written. There's plenty to be written on the government's malfeasance and how they handled the production of nuclear products on the site during the Cold War and for some time afterward. But the story on the malfeasance of the government through the Department of Energy to do this at less cost and more quickly is a sordid tale that is yet to be investigated at the level that I think it should. And while we're making progress and eventually the tank farms will be emptied, the fact that these tank farms continue to exist with millions of gallons of high-level waste where there could be thermal explosions and other leak offsite in the year 2015 is a story of malperformance.
In preparing for this episode, I also talked to Professor Aaron Katz. He teaches in the Department of Health Services at the University of Washington. He was a member of WPSR in the 80s and was also on the Nuclear Waste Advisory Council. I asked him why Washington citizens should be concerned about Hanford.
Well, I think what's important to know is that Hanford is a living threat. I mean, it's not something out of the history books, just out of the history books, that the activities there affect us all. The Columbia River runs through the reservation. Nuclear material and other toxins continue to leak towards and into the Columbia River. You know, most of us enjoy salmon, sturgeon, and other kinds of fish from that river, and we're not even talking about the Native American communities who rely on fish a lot more than the rest of us do for their diet. It's an amazingly beautiful place, and that contradiction, you go there and you say, God, this really ought to be brought back to that pristine natural resource that's there. You get a sense of that huge expanse of 500 plus square miles. So people really ought to understand that this is an existing part of our community, no matter what part of the state. It affects our food, it affects our water, it affects our politics.
Now, there are a lot of people who are concerned about Hanford, but to be honest, most of them have gray hair. If there's one thing that everyone that is working on Hanford agrees on, is that we need to have more young people involved, which is something Professor Katz tries to do at UW.
Right. I mean, first of all, it's just remarkable how many young adults, even those who have lived in the Seattle area for a long time, have never heard of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. There's just very little information that they get that, lets them know that there's this humongously polluted place on the eastern side of the state. But the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, the cleanup effort, presents all sorts of really interesting and important challenges and lessons for students in public health to understand. Challenges in policy and tensions between jurisdictions, between the state and the feds, between different federal agencies. And so I and a colleague wrote a case around Hanford that draws students into both the science, why is nuclear material a problem, so human pathways and the like, and they learn about the history of the green runs and things like that. But also the sort of policy issues, why do we have a tri-party agreement? Where did that come from? What has been the role of advocacy organizations in shaping the policy landscape around the Hanford Nuclear Reservation? So every year we have one group of public health graduate students delve into that case. They go on a site visit. We get a tour from the Department of Energy that happens in October this month. So it kind of keeps the issue alive for them.
Professor Katz mentioned something called the Green Run. This is probably the most controversial part of Hanford's history. In the 1940s, the U.S. wanted to estimate how much plutonium the Soviet Union was producing so we could have an idea of how many nuclear bombs they had built. To do this, the U.S. Air Force ordered workers at Hanford to intentionally release radioisotopes into the atmosphere on December 2nd and 3rd, 1949. Soon after, it began raining in the area, which brought the isotopes to the ground. They landed on the grass, and the cows ate the grass. These cows were the source of milk for many of the local residents. This intentional release was top secret until the Freedom of Information request brought it to light in the 1980s. I asked Dr. Amundson how he thought the discovery of this, as well as the deep-rooted culture of secrecy, affected the people that lived near Hanford.
The fact that farmers and ranchers in the area, in the counties around the Hanford Reservation, had been told for years that there was no concerns about the food they were eating, about leafy vegetables, about milk that was being produced, about raising their children there, and then came to learn later that for decades radiation had been released into their environment, including into onto their farms and crops, led to an immense surge of anger by people in the area that subsequently became known as the Downwinders, who began to advocate for information, eventually for a study, led to the Hanford thyroid disease study to try to understand what might have come about from iodine-131 releases that was the single largest isotope to be released. And it led to demands for compensation for health claims, whether or not many of the health issues that people were claiming were actually caused by the radiation. So it's hard for me to believe that the fact that the government, through the Department of Energy and through political leaders, had either kept the truth or lied to the public around here wasn't at least one contributor to the level of distrust and anger at government we see that characterizes much of our country right now, which is, of course, much broader. But these are additive things that cause people to not have confidence and trust in the very government that we depend on.
The words "a culture of secrecy" are often mentioned when talking about Hanford. Some say that those days are over. Others disagree. It's undeniable that when Hanford makes headlines, it is often because of a whistleblower. I asked Professor Katz what's his thoughts on the current culture at Hanford.
So, and this is one thing I talked to my MPH students about is we encourage our MPH students to look at Hanford as a possible career path. We need good people working out there, people who really care about the public health implications of the activities out there. It's really important for somebody who goes to work out there to understand this history, to understand the culture of secrecy that continues to pervade the activities out there, because somebody who goes to work out there is going to confront that some point in time and needs to have the consciousness that to understand that when certain policies are promulgated or certain activities are carried out, that it may in fact be a manifestation of that culture, and therefore, once you're conscious of that, you're better able to counteract the downsides of that culture.
I asked Dr. Amundson what he would say to someone who wanted to work out at Hanford.
If one were to work on the Hanford site and were working actually in the with the management and the removal of radioactive waste, they need to know enough about what the exposure possibilities are that they advocate for themselves for the protective material that they need to work safely, whether that's protective garb, whether it's respirators, whether it's just knowing that something is going on around you upwind if you're working out on some other aspect of the reservation. The protection of workers has been a scandal, and workers that are actually working in the field should know what the hazards are and should know what questions to ask about protecting themselves personally.
Lastly, I asked Dr. Amundson what was something about Hanford he thought everyone in Washington should know.
The tank farms holding a whole range of chemical and nuclear wastes at Hanford continues to be a ticking time bomb. In Russia, a similar tank exploded in the 50s. Not a nuclear explosion, but a thermal explosion. And it disseminated millions of curies of radioactive activity over hundreds of square miles. It does not take a thermonuclear explosion to spread nuclear waste with material that lasts for days, for weeks, for years, and for centuries over the landscape. At one point, there was a consideration for declaring the Hanford Nuclear Reservation a national sacrifice zone because it literally couldn't be healed up. If there was a thermal explosion in a waste tank, it would basically create a sacrifice zone over a large area of the Yakima Valley, including the agricultural lands surrounding it and potentially downwind. We know where the waste went from the dispersal of radioactive material into the air during the Green Run and other sites. The waste, I was involved in that study, and the pollution in the air went basically north and east. If there were a thermal explosion in a waste tank, it would similarly distribute radioactive material over a very large area and would essentially create a waste zone around the site. So this problem is not well understood by the public, and while contamination of the Columbia River is certainly a concern and the huge aquifers under the site, the greatest risk would be an air explosion contaminating huge areas of the Yakima area.
Well, that has been the first episode of Down by the River, Stories of Hanford. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you continue to listen. We have 19 more of these to go. You can find those in the coming months at iTunes, SoundCloud, or YouTube. If you want more information on where to listen, or more information on Hanford, visit our website at wpsr.org. There's a Hanford tab, and underneath there's a section for the podcast. And as much as I want you to listen to this, I want to hear from you. The purpose of this podcast is to help inform the citizens of Washington about Hanford, which means if you have any questions or comments, I would like to hear them. Or maybe you have a story you want to tell. Please email me at daniel@wpsr.org. That's DANIEL@wpsr.org. I want to thank Dr. Amundson and Professor Cass for taking the time to be interviewed. And most of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen.